The auction block in Savannah, Georgia, smelled of salt air and shame. It was the summer of 1847, and the square was packed. Merchants fanning themselves with their hats, women clutching parasols, children perched on shoulders to catch a better view, as though what was happening before them were theatre. Elias Cobb stood at the center of it all, barefoot on sun-scorched wood, his wrists bound with rope that had already eaten into his skin. He was 23 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a face so quietly composed that several onlookers later claimed they had mistaken his expression for arrogance. It was not arrogance, it was something far more enduring, though none of them had a word for it yet. He had been born in Virginia on a tobacco farm, the son of a woman named Mercy, who had died when he was 9, whispering prayers into his ear until she couldn't anymore. She had been the kind of woman who believed that God saw everything, every cruelty, every tear, every small and hidden kindness. She had passed this belief to her son, like a lantern passed through darkness, hand to hand, and somehow, despite everything that followed, he had never let it go out. The man who purchased him that afternoon was named Colonel Harlan Voss. Voss was 51, heavy in the jowls, with small, pale eyes that missed very little. He was not known in the county as particularly cruel. Cruelty to him was inefficient. But neither was he known as kind. He ran a cotton operation some 40 miles inland with meticulous precision, the way other men kept ledgers, and he regarded every soul on his property, enslaved or otherwise, as a variable in a long equation whose only answer was profit. He paid $640 for Elias without blinking, studied him the way a man studies a horse, and said only, "You'll work the fields until I decide otherwise." And so began 12 years. What most people did not understand about Elias, what perhaps even Elias himself could not have fully articulated in those early years, was that he was always watching, not with bitterness, though he had cause enough for that, not with resentment, though that would have been entirely understandable. He watched the way a man watches who is trying to learn something essential about the nature of the world he has been thrown into. He watched Voss. He watched the way the colonel's hands trembled slightly each morning before his first drink of whiskey, and steadied afterward. He watched the way Voss spoke gently to his horses and sharply to his wife. He watched the way the man's jaw tightened whenever letters arrived from his son in Philadelphia. A son, it was whispered, who had refused to return to the plantation, who had gone north and not come back. He watched the overseer, a man named Tatum, who took pleasure in small humiliations the way other men took pleasure in tobacco. Tatum had never been given power over anything before in his life, and now he had been given power over people, and the combination had curdled something inside him that might once have been human. Elias watched Tatum most carefully of all. He also watched the other enslaved men and women, watched Clara, who kept herb gardens in secret and healed fevers nobody was supposed to know about, watched old Joseph, who had been on the Voss land since before Harlan's father died, and who had outlasted 3 overseers by being indispensable, watched the children who ran between the cabins in the evenings, shrieking with a joy that seemed to defy every attempt the world made to extinguish it. He learned from all of them. He learned that survival was not merely physical. He learned that dignity was not something that could be taken from a person. It could only be surrendered, and he had no intention of surrendering his. In his 5th year at Voss's plantation, something happened that changed the trajectory of what was coming. Colonel Voss's wife, Charlotte, fell gravely ill with a fever that the county doctor pronounced near fatal. For 2 weeks, she lay in the upstairs bedroom while her husband paced the floors below, and Tatum ran the fields without supervision, and everything on the property seemed to loosen from its moorings. It was Clara who went to Elias one evening and said, "She's going to die unless something changes. I know what can help her, but I need someone to convince the colonel to let me try." "Why me?" Elias asked. "Because," Clara said simply, "you're the only one he actually listens to, even if he doesn't know he's listening." This was a startling thing to hear, but Elias turned it over in his mind and thought it might be true. Over 5 years he had managed, through some combination of competence and quiet, to become something adjacent to trusted. Never free, never equal, never safe, but trusted in the specific way that useful things are trusted. He went to the colonel. It took courage of a kind that has no drama in it, only the cold clarity of choosing to do something despite every reason not to. He presented Clara's knowledge respectfully, without flourish, and waited. Harlan Voss stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." Charlotte Voss recovered. After that, Voss began to use Elias differently. Less in the fields, more in the house, teaching him figures, having him keep secondary records, sending him on errands into town with papers that marked him as authorized to conduct business on the colonel's behalf. It was not freedom. It was a longer, more complicated chain. But it was also, Elias understood, an education, and he took everything from it that he could. In his 10th year, Tatum decided that Elias had grown too comfortable. The precise cause was never entirely clear. Perhaps Tatum had witnessed the colonel treating Elias with something approaching respect and found it unbearable. Perhaps it was the evening a group of white farmhands from a neighboring property saw Elias riding alone on a horse with Voss's seal on the saddlebag, and someone made a comment about it in Tatum's presence. Perhaps it required no cause at all. Perhaps it was simply the nature of what Tatum was. Whatever the reason, on a grey November morning, Tatum accused Elias of theft. He claimed a sum of money was missing from the estate accounts and pointed directly at Elias as the culprit. He presented what appeared to be evidence, a discrepancy in the ledger that Tatum himself had manufactured over a period of weeks with painstaking, petty craftwork. Voss heard the accusation. He called Elias before him. He looked at the ledger, and then he looked at Elias, and something in the old man's face, something that might, in another life, have been decency, flickered. But he did not defend him. The punishment that followed was not the worst thing that had ever been done to an enslaved man on a southern plantation. History has recorded far worse, and the silence around. Over, Elias lay in the dust behind the over. Elias lay in the dust behind the barn, and looked up at a sky the color of old pewter, and felt something inside him approaching the edge of a very great darkness. He could have hated. He had every right to hate. He lay there, and he understood, perhaps more clearly than he ever had before, that hatred was available to him, warm, immediate, requiring nothing except surrender to it. It would have been so easy. Instead, he thought of his mother. He thought of Mercy, and the lantern she had pressed into his hands, and the way she had whispered prayers until she couldn't any more. And he held on to that light with everything he had. He did not extinguish his anger. He was not a saint, and this is not a story about sainthood. He felt his anger fully, let it move through him like a storm through a field. And when it passed, he was still there, still himself, still holding the lantern. He decided something, lying in that dust. He decided that he would not let any man, not Tatum, not Voss, not the whole edifice of a system built on human suffering, determine what he was capable of, not even in his own private heart. The institution of slavery in America was by 1859 a thing with cracks in it, though those cracks were not yet visible to everyone. Underground currents were running, names were being spoken in secret. And one autumn evening, a man appeared at the edge of the Voss property, a contact in a network Elias had learned of through careful years-long listening, and the word was spoken that a path was open. Elias left on a Tuesday, 2 hours before dawn. He moved north through a darkness so complete it was like moving through the earth itself. He was guided by people he would never know the names of. A farm wife who left a lantern burning, a free black ferryman who asked no questions, a Quaker family who fed him silently and pointed him toward Ohio. He arrived in Cincinnati in December of 1859, frostbitten in 2 toes, 35 pounds lighter than he'd left, and free. It was 1866 when Elias Cobb, by then running a small school for freed people in Cincinnati, teaching reading and arithmetic and the rudiments of legal self-advocacy, received a letter. The letter was from Georgia. Colonel Harlan Voss was dying. He had survived the war by the narrowest of margins, had watched his plantation burn in Sherman's march, had lost 2 nephews at Antietam, and had emerged from the other side of the conflict as a diminished, hollow version of the man he'd been. He was 70 now, living in a single rented room in Savannah, his wife long dead, his son still estranged. He was writing, the letter said, to ask for something he understood he had no right to ask for. He wanted to speak to Elias. The letter had been written and forwarded through a chain of intermediaries that revealed how hard Voss had worked to find him. Years of searching, apparently, through church networks and Freedmen's Bureau records. The handwriting was shaky, almost unreadable in places. It said only, "I know what I was. I know what I permitted. I am writing anyway, because there is no one else left, and because there are things that ought to be said before they become impossible to say." Elias read the letter 3 times. He set it down on the table in the small room above the school where he slept, and he looked out the window at the Cincinnati street below, at the free people moving through it, at the children who came to his school each morning with their faces open and ready. And he thought for a long time. His colleague, a woman named Margaret, who taught the older students, found him sitting there an hour later and asked what was wrong. He showed her the letter. She read it. Then she looked at him with an expression that contained equal parts concern and disbelief. "You're not thinking of going," she said. He didn't answer directly. He said, "My mother used to say that forgiveness wasn't for the person being forgiven. She said it was for the person doing the forgiving. She said, carrying a stone long enough will change the shape of your hand." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elias, he kept you in chains for 12 years. He let Tatum beat you for something you didn't do. I know, and you want to go speak to him." "I want to go," Elias said carefully, "and say what is true, not to make him feel better, but because it's true, and because I've decided that truth matters more than whether he deserves to hear it." He arrived in Savannah on a March afternoon in 1866, 20 years after he had first stood on that auction block, and the city looked nothing like it had. The war had taken something from it that wouldn't come back. Not the buildings, which still stood mostly intact, but the particular self-assurance of a world that had believed itself permanent. He found Voss in a room on the second floor of a boarding house near the waterfront. The colonel was in a chair by the window, and the man Elias saw there was almost unrecognizable. Whatever authority had animated him once was entirely gone. What remained was simply an old man, frightened and small, with the shaking hands and clouded eyes of someone very near the end. Voss saw Elias in the doorway, and something crossed his face. Surprise, recognition, and something else, something rawer than either. Elias came in. He sat down in the chair across from the old man. He did not shake his hand. He simply sat and waited. Voss spoke first. He spoke for a long time, and what came out of him was not eloquent. It was halting and circular, and sometimes contradictory. A man trying to account for a life he had never examined honestly before, and finding the task nearly beyond him. He spoke about the ledger, about Tatum, about the morning he had looked at Elias in his study and known the truth and turned away from it anyway. He spoke about his son, who had written him a letter in 1855, telling him that he would not return to a house built on something monstrous, and how Voss had read the letter and burned it and never replied. He spoke about Charlotte's recovery, and how he had always known, somewhere beneath the arithmetic of his life, what that had cost Elias to arrange. He did not ask to be forgiven. Whatever else he was, he seemed to understand that forgiveness was not something that could be requested. When he finished, he looked at Elias the way a man looks who expects a blow. Elias sat with the silence for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to tell you that what you did was all right, because it wasn't. I'm not going to tell you it didn't cost me things I'll never get back. It did. But I've been carrying what happened on your land for 20 years, and I've decided I'm done carrying it. Not for your sake, for mine." Voss was very still. "I forgive you," Elias said, "not because you've earned it, not because you've said the right words, but because I've decided that what I'm building, my school, my students, my life, is too important to be built on a foundation of bitterness, and I need my hands free to build it." The old man's eyes filled. Elias stood up. He looked at Harlan Voss one last time. Just a man now, just frightened and old and alone. And he felt something move through him that was neither triumph nor sorrow, but something cleaner than either. He walked out of the room. He walked out of the boarding house. He stood on the Savannah street in the March sunlight, and he breathed. Harlan Voss died 6 weeks later. His son, learning of the visit somehow, traveled south for the burial and afterwards sought out Elias through letters. They corresponded briefly, carefully. Two men working towards something neither of them had adequate language for yet. The son donated a sum of money to Elias's school. Elias accepted it. The school grew. By 1880, it was serving over 200 students. By 1890, several of its graduates had gone on to teach in schools of their own. The work that Elias had called too important to be built on bitterness spread outward in ways he could not have fully predicted, seeding itself through communities, taking root in the minds of children who would go on to build other things, who would go on to carry the lantern further than he'd had any reason to hope. The people who knew Elias in those years often said, when asked about him, that there was something in his manner that was difficult to name. It was not serenity exactly, not happiness, nothing so simple. It was more like the quality of someone who has set down a very heavy thing and learned to walk differently for having carried it. Freer in the stride, lighter in the step, though not unmarked by what came before. He lived to be 78 years old. He died in a house he owned, in a city where he was free, surrounded by people who loved him. And in the school he had built, long after he was gone, a student once found an old piece of paper tucked into the back of a ledger book, covered in his handwriting. It contained only a few lines, and no one was entirely certain when it had been written, in the years of chains, or the years after, or somewhere in between. It said, "Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. It is not the same as saying the wound was small, or that the one who made it has been absolved by your saying so. Forgiveness is an act you perform for yourself, and no one else. It is deciding that the rest of your life will not be owned by what was done to you. It is the only form of freedom that no one can take away, because it happens entirely inside you, where no chains reach. I did not forgive easily. I did not forgive quickly, but I forgave in the end because I had things to build, and I needed my hands